Hello, buds. It is Andy, and I swear I have not been kidnapped. This is not a cry for help, but this is the second intro in a week where I am telling you about a product you can buy from us. I know it is very out of character, but after much demand, we are bringing back our Cube Will Outlive Magic playmat for a second edition. If you're an avid listener to the podcast, you will be familiar with the immense physical and emotional toll that the production and fulfillment of the first round of mats had on me. Personally, I am simply not built for this, folks. So I am very glad to announce that we are partnered with Citrus Supply for the second edition of the playmat. Our buddy Cal is going to be handling all of the production and coordination and customer service and payments and everything. So you can pre-order this version of the playmat at Citrus Supply. The link will be in the show notes. Like the first edition of the playmat, this is going to be a pre-order, so we're only going to make as many as we have orders. The pre-order window is open right now as you are listening to this, and it will be open until November 16th. So if you want a copy of this playmat, please go order one. I get emails almost every week from people that want a copy of this playmat, and I don't know if or when there is going to be a third edition, so this is your chance. Lightning round of details real quick. The second edition of the playmat is different than the first edition. We no longer have a gold foil treatment on the ribbon and typography that is on the playmat. Instead, it is now rendered in a rainbow. I really wanted the second edition to look different than the first edition so that everyone that got a first edition playmat, yours are special forever. Every edition I want to be slightly unique. And the vendor we're working with this time around does not have the capability to do the foil printing. However, this does mean the playmat is a little bit more affordable. It's going to be $40 plus shipping, and there is going to be international shipping available, though at an additional cost because I got so incredibly burned on that last time. Finally, if you're a member of our Patreon, you should check the Patreon page where there is a coupon code for all members to get $5 off. Friendly little plug here to join the Patreon, too. If you join, you get $5 off the playmat. It's basically your first month of the Patreon free. Look at me doing commerce. Ready?
Yeah.
Great.
Genesis Wave.
You're just going to say it? You were just going to start like that?
That's just where my brain's at.
How long have you been Genesis Wave pilled?
8 or 9 years.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. We should probably tell people this is the Lucky Paper Radio podcast, and I'm Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host Anthony, putting over 100 counters on Helix Pinnacle-matics.
I have done that a couple of times. It's a very fun thing to do. It's fun to technically have a win condition in your deck, just in case people are like, and then what do you do? And you're like, I guess I eventually draw a Helix Pinnacle.
Yeah, if people don't scoop to you putting your whole deck into play, because all they see is more ramp. Mm-hmm. Then you can just reveal your Helix Pinnacle, and they often don't even make you do it.
I would hope not. No, you know what? You should. I feel like there's something to when somebody has a stupid combo, you just make them do it. And then, like if a dog does something bad, you just rub their face in it and say, look what you did. Are you okay with that? I'm not sure that's actually what you're supposed to do with dogs. I'm
Probably
not expert in dog training at all.
Not. I don't think so.
You should be nice to them, but hold your play group accountable when they do rude things.
Speaking of being held accountable, Anthony, here we are, being held to account. We, on our previous episode, which has not yet come out at the time of recording this episode, we're talking about our top 5 favorite cards of all time. And in the preamble of introducing one of your favorite cards, you said, well, this is my only one of my top 5 cards. It isn't in one of my cubes right now. And I said before I heard what that card was, well, clearly that has to be the new start of our next Emergent Cube Design episode, where we take a single card and we each separately, independently, kind of fan out from that card and explore how we might discover an entire cube's worth of archetypes and themes just from one single card. I said we should do it around that card no matter what it is, and then the card was Genesis Wave.
Which we're both delighted by. It's a great card that should be in every cube. I don't know, I have mixed feelings about that because I think we're going to get into some of the challenges with this particular card, but also it is a card that I really enjoy, and I don't have a cube that it makes any sense in at all, so I think that there is a non-zero chance that this actually leads to me making a cube that I put Genesis Wave in.
All right. I love to hear that there's a possibility of this becoming a real thing, and I'm sure our listeners are going to send a lot of great suggestions as well.
Absolutely. It always happens.
All right, well, I'll just say it. I'm not excited about this being the card.
I didn't think so. I think we should definitely talk about some of the issues with Genesis Wave. I think before that, maybe we should go into a little bit more detail on the stipulation here. We're sort of talking about a cube, starting with one particular card, and we've done this 2 times.
I'm going to find out while you're talking.
Trade Routes and Goblin Charbelcher. And I think many people, when they approach a cube, it's very easy to sort of start with some theme or some individual card or mechanic and say, I want to make a cube that is all about this. Like, everybody's going to be playing the mirror match of this particular thing all day, every day. And that's not what we're trying to do here. What instead we're trying to do is say, let's start with this one card, see what works with it, and then sort of see what works with that and kind of use it as a nucleation point or a seed crystal to build a cube around. And it might mean that we end up in a place where we don't actually have a cube with Genesis Wave in it at all, and that's fine. It was just sort of there as a starting point. And I think the other major stipulation is I don't think we should worry too much about power level or exactly how much all the cards are going to play together. Like, there's going to be a fine-tuning stage.
We're the design phase, not the development phase.
Yeah, the sort of brainstorming, get stuff down on the page, and then we'll do the editing later. So we might talk pretty theoretically, and you might say, well, those cards don't make sense in the same cube, but that's fine. That's what we're here for in the starting phase.
And the reason we have done 2 episodes, just 2 in the past, just Charbelcher and Trade Routes. So Parker has asked us multiple times to do Woolly Thoktar, which I have also mixed feelings about.
That one's just like a 3-mana 5/5.
Yeah, it's a vanilla. Something. It costs Jund, and I think it's a 5/4 or something like that. It's just a vanilla creature, which certainly is a challenge in that it gives you very little to latch onto. Anyway, we've only done it twice before. This will be our 3rd time. We're calling it Cube Design Iron Chef, as we've called it in the past. And I think we should stick with that name. I think it works. Okay. And the reason we started doing this was because this is actually the way that you and I believe most people should build their first cube. I mean, if not cards from your collection, if you're going to design it from sort of, design principles up, we are, generally speaking, not the biggest fan of the, choose a bunch of 2-color archetypes method and then find colors to fit those archetypes. I think it's much better to sort of just play in the space. Find a card you really like that you really want to play, especially in a limited context, and see what other cards that leads to that you might want to play alongside or against or in parallel to that particular card.
Yeah, and I would say in practice for my own cube design, often it's not an individual card, but it's like I've kind of in the background done some process like this with a couple cards, and then suddenly those webs kind of connect, and I'm like, okay, I had been thinking about this kind of spells theme built around this particular card, or, White Mane Lion, just to revisit the cards we talked about last week, was definitely one of the benchmark cards for regular cube, and then eventually that kind of, came together into something that was enough cards that I felt I was ready to move into that editing phase.
Eventually you turned it into a cube where White Mane Lion is a D.
C minus.
C minus! So, we've each done this exercise for Genesis Wave. Let's first start with the rules text of Genesis Wave. Genesis Wave is a sorcery that reads, X, green, green, green. Reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put any number of permanent cards with mana value X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Then put all cards revealed this way that weren't put onto the battlefield into your graveyard.
Fun.
Sure. I imagine it's fun to cast a big Genesis Wave.
Have you never done it?
Of course not.
Okay.
When would I have done this? I'm never putting this in a commander deck.
You're right.
And I'm also never drafting this in a cube. For me, the real challenge here is how can I make this a card I will play in this cube? Because I will be strongly incentivized to not play this card no matter what context
man, I'm
I'm
so
in.
excited for your cube that has 0 permanence, and your whole goal is this is just a mill X card.
I mean, that is one use case for it. I still remember the day that I learned about mulch in Constructed and how it is not a way to find lands. That's not what it does, actually.
It's a mill 4 card?
Pretty much, yeah.
But you can also get a land.
I mean, you do get lands. It's better than mill 4 because it also draws you a card usually, but the milling is actually the feature in most Constructed contexts.
Okay, so why don't you like Genesis Wave?
I just really like low-to-the-ground efficient Magic. When I have a turn in Magic where it's late in the game and I have 5, 6, 7 mana at my disposal, I want to use that to cast 4 spells or activate 4 abilities, not cast one big spell and cross my fingers and hope it works. That is just not the kind of Magic I enjoy.
And putting 4 permanents into play just doesn't do the same thing for you because it feels kind of similar. You gotta admit, it's a little similar.
The bigger thing is putting the Genesis Wave on the stack and crossing your fingers that your opponent doesn't have a counterspell, which we should talk about.
Yeah,
because this is probably not a cube where you should put
where we want
most
to start.
counterspells. Or that you hit things that are reasonable or worth it, or that you just pay X equals 5 and hit 2 of your 6 drops, and you're like, well, I guess it sucks to suck. I think it's just a lot of variance and a lot of reward for the game going very long, and those are 2 things in Magic that, generally speaking, my cube design proclivities have pushed me away from. So for those who don't know me, I'm definitely working uphill to build a cube where I would personally be interested in putting Genesis Wave in my deck.
That makes a lot of sense. I do also think we should mention early in the episode that we do have a cards mention page where we will probably be listing a lot of cards in this specific episode. Before even thinking about individual cards, though, Genesis Wave poses some specific questions or some specific challenges, because it's
Question
not
number
just,
one, does your opponent have a counterspell?
Yeah, it's not just like, okay, this is like a 2-mana threat that's like pretty reasonable. I can put this in most cubes. This is 1-for-1 removal. That's pretty flexible. And it's also not, trade routes, which asks a very specific question about, like, can you make putting lands in your graveyard? Can you make discard? Can you make drawing extra cards work? Those are things that like are pretty easy to latch onto. Genesis Wave just says, does this make sense in an environment where you want to cast a huge giant spell and hope it works? And also then, can you have some kind of like meaningful counterplay? Because, yeah, the worst case is this is just a card that's a total flop because your opponent has a single counterspell and it does nothing, and your whole like exciting game plan just fizzles. It also isn't great if your opponent can't do anything about it, and it's just like, okay, you cast your 10-mana Genesis Wave and now the game is just over. So the real challenge I think we face as cube designers, for the kind of gameplay that we enjoy at least, is how do we create an environment where this has the right amount of counterplay, where this can be a card that is somewhat functional, it's a dream worth striving for, but it still has that kind of like interactivity that we enjoy.
I do think this is actually a really good example card for the purposes of these episodes, because like you said, I think it has less obvious mechanical hooks to a card like Trade Routes. Honestly, probably even less obvious mechanical hooks to a card like Goblin Charbelcher.
Yeah,
that was intentionally an episode we were like, let's work uphill and take a card that traditionally does not work in limited or singleton environments and try to make it work in a cube. But it doesn't have as many obvious hooks. Like, on its face, yeah, just any cube where you can reliably get to 6, 7, or 8 mana, and there's not a lot of cheap counter magic running around, this card would be viable. I would say, right up front, I would say that I think in a cube like this, maybe you don't have to roll out counter spells entirely, but I would say that I'm never putting a Force Spike or a Daze or...
Interesting.
Like, those I think are so punishing to a big X spell like this, and I don't want people to have to think about playing around them. Maybe like a Mana Leak, where it's like, you're not even going to play right up by 3 no matter what anyway, right? Like, that's so much. But like a Force Spike or a Mana Tithe would be just dreadful in a cube that you want people to actually cast Genesis Wave and not get punished by. There's actually a lot more specific stuff that I at least sort of came up with that works with Genesis Wave that becomes a hook you can then tie a bunch of mechanics and themes to. So I think it's a good example of how you can really mine an otherwise, on its surface, plain card that doesn't really have thematic or mechanical tie-ins, and find those tie-ins to start building themes for a cube from.
Interesting. I think I started in a similar space. Like, counterspells are that obvious like point of difficulty where it's like it really can just make this swingy card do nothing. In one way, like, it makes sense. It's like you want interaction against this really swingy card, but because it is a card that sort of invites you to make it your whole game plan, I agree that's really not great. But I think I would disagree in the details a little bit. I would not want it in a cube where there are either a single Force Spike, because you really don't want to just be running into the like, okay, this was not something that I could plan around. There was one Force Spike. I didn't even see it in the draft if this is my first time drafting this cube, and then you just sort of got by it. I would really not want to put this in a cube with a lot of just hard counterspells, whether that's counterspell or cancel or anything else that's just totally, even Mana Leak, I would just call that a hard counterspell in most cases.
Yeah, it basically is, yeah.
But I think if you put this in a cube that has 8 Force Spikes and sensors and similar types of effects that just tax you by 1 mana, now I think you're in a different space. And the idea of, okay...
Yeah, that space is hell.
Can I play around a Force Spike? Do I want to be paying, 1 less for X for my Genesis Wave? I think that actually gets into a much more interesting space. I don't know if it's a great space, but I think that's much more interesting than just Counterspell. Because even if you say, like, a 4-mana counterspell, like, your opponent's going to have the mana to keep up, or to be able to play their 4-mana counterspell against your 10-mana Genesis Wave.
Well, the real question, I think, is not, like, I don't think you have to have 0 counterspells in your environment for this to be a thing. I think hard counterspells are okay. I think maybe even efficient hard counterspells are okay, because theoretically a deck that's playing this at its top end should also be putting pressure on your opponent up to that point. If you do nothing that they have to respond to at all, and then on 10 mana cast Genesis Wave, maybe you should be punished, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of my attitude. Whereas if you are using this in a deck that has, other similar cards that are filling a similar space, which we should get into, because one of the first things I do in these exercises is think, what are cards that are somewhat redundant or similar enough to this card? Because if there's a whole cube with exactly 1 copy of Genesis Wave, sure, you could come up with some themes that, connect to it that might make that 1 card castable in a deck or two. But I think to really start to make the cube start to have an identity that it revolves around it, you want other cards that do kind of similar things. And I have a couple of examples I came up with that were also sitting at the forefront of my mind as like cards that were interesting in this space. But to the Force Spike point, like, yeah, I think it's worth maybe doing that thought exercise. I personally think that Force Spikes are awful in cubes that the games go long in, because on 99% of your spells, you can just afford to play around a Force Spike all the time, and having a big X spell or multiple big X spells in the cube that tempt you to not play around it is just inviting horrible bad feelings, I think. Because those Force Spikes can be bad most of the time, and then every once in a while, some new player or like less enfranchised player or player that didn't see any of the Force Spikes in the list is going to wander right into the world's biggest bear trap and then just feel terrible. And like, to what end?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that it's worth considering who you're designing the cube for, and if you're thinking of like broad appeal, like I'm going to bring this to a cube event, so I don't really know exactly who's going to be playing it, then I definitely would agree with you, like leaning away from that. If you know you have like an enfranchised play group that likes that kind of counterplay, I would say maybe more than Force Spike, like Censor, I think is a card that gets
better Force
cubed.
Spike.
It's just better Force Spike, yeah. I mean, because I agree, like the fact that it's like, okay, this is going to be great in the late game if I'm going to get my opponent got, and it's like something my opponent's going to try to play around. I think there's some interesting texture there, and cycling it is fun, and the fact that it like you can cycle it away in the late game when it doesn't matter in certain matchups makes it a lot more interesting.
See, the specificity of that interaction makes me feel like that could maybe be an interesting avenue to pursue in like a Genesis Wave focused like Dan variant, where it's like, okay, we've all got Genesis Waves and Force Spikes and some other cards, and like the test is
what
like
is
the
creature that you wouldn't want to just cast? I'm curious.
I have some
about
ideas
this.
Actually in that vein.
Phage. But then you're forcing your opponent to cast Genesis.
No,
Waves.
Flage kills you.
Flage, not Phage. No, Phage, not Flage. Yes, the one that just kills you. I don't know. That's a card that does
Flage
something
is the one that just kills you.
You don't cast it.
Wait, no. Yeah, Phage is the one that just kills you. Flage
Yes.
is the new Boros Titan.
Yeah.
That one's just, that's too good for a Cube Genesis Wave under any circumstances. Look, let's just get down to brass tacks. Let's get into cards. The way I think about this, and I wonder if you're similar, is I think about this as like levels of remove from the original seed.
Yeah.
So I have a bunch of things here at level 1, actually, and then I have a couple things at level 2, which are like, from my level 1, here are things that now make sense with that up level 1, but that are different than Genesis Wave. And you could always just keep doing this exercise more. Like, our goal in this episode is to kind of inspire people, show you that it is possible to just take a card you like and come up with themes that suit it for a cube you can play it in. And I just started with Ramp, Anthony, and I think you want Ramp in a cube where you have Genesis Wave. I think that's pretty obvious, I dare say. I mean, I don't want to take anything for granted. I think in a cube where you have a triple green spell that you want people to dump a big X value into, I think that is a cube where Ramp should be welcome. And I specifically did think about the type of Ramp, and I want permanent-based Ramp. I do not want Rampant Gropes that I can't hit off my Genesis Wave when I cast it later. And the fact that I want permanent-based Ramp, there are like 2 cards that came up that I thought were the perfect fit for this cube. One is Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, which is the devotion land, which rewards you having a bunch of permanents in play. So if we assume that we are going to want perhaps a more permanent heavy environment because it makes your Genesis Wave better if you have more permanents in your deck, then Nykthos, I think, is a really great ramp spell that could potentially get you to either a big Genesis Wave or be the payoff after you do resolve that Genesis Wave. And the next one I thought of is Lotus Bloom, which is the Black Lotus with Suspend, because that one you can just put into play off Genesis Wave, which is very cool. You don't have to cast it, you don't have to put it on Suspend, so you just put it right into play, even though it's got no mana value, or no mana cost, rather. And also, it's the kind of thing that allows you one big turn, where if you play that on turn 1 or 2, by the time it comes off Suspend, you can now cast perhaps a little bit of an early Genesis Wave, and it kind of works on both sides. I also thought a lot about the aura-based ramp spells, your Overgrowths, your Utopia Sprawls, your Wild Growths, and obviously Mana Dorks, I think, work perfectly well here as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Ramp is obviously part of my journey here as well. I would jump in and before I really thought about Ramp, I had one level in between, which is, in addition to counterspells, the other type of counterplay that made a lot of sense to me was Wraths. And I think there's kind of 2 directions you could go with that. One is just to be like, okay, similar to counterspells, like we don't necessarily want Wrath of God to just like totally negate your huge Genesis Wave and make that an unfulfilling game. I think similar to the Force Spikes, the other way that you can go is just put enough Wraths in the cube that becomes a dominant feature, and that is something you are constantly playing around. And that's, after thinking about it a little bit, kind of the direction that I wanted to push, is to say, let's make this an environment that has a bunch of Wraths of different types, have a bunch of Pyroclasms, a bunch of Infests, things that are going to deal a bunch of damage to a bunch of creatures. And I think that makes it a little bit more interesting in that there's ways that you can make that work. So first of all, you're like setting player expectations that this is going to be a feature. So your ramp spells cannot necessarily be in the form of just a bunch of Llanowar elves because they're going to die before you actually get to cast your big Genesis wave. So for me, the ramp spells that sort of seemed like the best value are things like Sakura Tribe Elder, because sure, it's a rampant growth, but it's also a permanent, which means it makes sense with your Genesis wave. I love what you said about like find other things that are a little bit in a similar space, because sure, we could break Singleton and put a bunch of the exact same cards, but having a couple payoffs that reward the same deck makes sense. Primal Surge is the other sort of like iconic card from my worst behavior days of Commander, which
that's
just
one where you
says,
just reveal the top card. If it's a permanent, it goes into play. You keep doing it.
If your whole deck is permanents, you just like put it all in play. Those can be functionally kind of the same card in certain decks. So yeah, thinking about like making sure that my ramp is permanent based, but not too tied to creatures, like Sakura Tribe Elder is perfect. Artifact based ramp makes a lot of sense. And another thing that I sort of put in this similar category was things like Elvish Visionary, just things that are going to put bodies in play and interact with stuff and keep you drawing lands so that you can hit your land drop consistently into the late game. What do you think about this idea of having like a fairly heavy, and this is going to interact in other ways, but have a fairly wrath heavy environment for this exercise?
I didn't think too much about Wraths, to be honest. I think there's so many ways you could design the environment to be tuned to however many Wraths you wanted to play for other reasons, right? Like you mentioned, a Wrath could just undo all the value of a Genesis wave. Not if everything has ETB or like some other value.
Exactly, yeah.
So you could very much have a ton of board wipes, and Genesis wave could still be great because it enters battlefield and you deal 15 damage to your opponent and draw 3 cards, and who cares what happens after that point? Like, you've already taken the game away, basically. You could also, obviously, I think a lot of my direction, spoiler, is going down a lot of non-creature permanents, and so there are fewer board wipes for all enchantments or all artifacts, or, fewer competitively costed board wipes, or at least that would be a very particular kind of environment if we were including cards like Meltdown or something, right? That would be a very particular type of environment if you wanted to include stuff like that. My sort of baseline for most cubes is to assume some number of creature board wipes and probably no other kinds of board wipes. And I think what I've got just kind of is compatible with that. I don't think my sort of like start here would be like undone by a Wrath of God. I think it'd be fine. Sure. I would not be excited to see Wrath of God in my opponent's deck.
My normal baseline of maybe just how I build decks, the kind of
Don't
magic
worry,
that
you can just put
happens.
Avacyn or Archetype of Endurance and play off your Genesis wave.
I'm not going to do that.
Then you'll be so safe.
I won't do it. I would love to be safe. But that was the other tweak, is like saying, okay, I want Genesis wave to be powerful and answerable with a Wrath, but then I think it's kind of these like levels of interaction. It's like, okay, I want this to be answerable, but then I don't want it to be totally answerable. So creating an environment that has the right balance of, I want to just put some beefy stuff in play that is some creatures that's going to win me a game, but I also want the opportunity to, like you said, have a bunch of non-creature permanents that maybe are either immune to a Wrath or are able to generate some value in other ways, as well as, creatures that have entered the battlefield abilities that, even in the face of a Wrath, will get you some value and not sort of negate the Wrath entirely. But it is, I think, about finding that balance of making sure you have the kinds of threats that you want the Wrath of God to be meaningful, but not game-ending.
Sure.
And sort of related to that, I was also thinking of largely leaning the cube fairly small, just having overall the sort of creature size fairly small, which also makes sense with, I want games that are going to go long, where you casting a huge spell for 10 mana is going to make sense. I think not having a super aggressive deck makes sense.
So you mean small in terms of like relative to their mana cost, small bodies?
I think both, like lower mana cost and lower bodies, partly because it gives you, I think, a little bit more interesting flexibility in terms of, okay, well, if we have a bunch of pyroclasms, making something have a 3 toughness makes it a little bit more meaningful, and it sort of creates some more space there to tune those kinds of effects. It also, I think, going back to, again, the sort of bad habits that I think Genesis Wave creates, not having that experience of like, oh, I know I have 3 6-drops in my deck, so I really want to make sure I'm casting this for at least the full, 9? Being more willing to say like, yeah, I'm just going to cast this at a lower mana value, and I know I have a Regrowth or an Eternal Witness, so, worst case, this is like another ramp spell, and I can cast it again, or cast something, one of those similar interchangeable payoffs later in the game.
So the next thing I thought about, my next sort of level 1 layer, was something we've kind of alluded to a little bit already, which was permanent-based interaction.
Yep.
I would love my removal spells in my deck, or my other interactive spells, to be permanent-based, so I can also hit them off of Genesis Wave, which brings up some obvious, like, I would say cube staples, cards that show up in a lot of cubes, like the Spell Bombs, Aether Spell Bomb, Power 8 Spell Bomb, very popular cube cards. Maybe they're just Baltimore, community cube cards. I'm not sure. But I feel like I see them a lot. I think
Pirate Spellbomb we see fairly often. Some of the other ones maybe are just our fascination with the little trinkets and cantrips.
Yeah, I love putting the seals in cubes, so seal of removal and seal of fire, and I think certainly in this cube, artifacts and enchantments are going to be a feature, at least in my version of it, so the seal of primordium and seal of cleansing also might make sense here. There's also some spicier ones that I turned up here. So in terms of like permanent-based board wipes, we have Oblivion Stone, which could be kind of cool to Genesis Wave into your Oblivion Stone, make a bunch of mana, put some fate counters on things. I found a card I'd never seen before, Dragonback Assault, which is 3 and Teamer, so 6 mana total, which is an enchantment that enters the battlefield and deals 3 damage to each creature and planeswalker, and has Landfall, make a 4/4 dragon, which is obviously both permanent-based interaction and also very cool with Genesis Wave, because you can hit that and a bunch of lands, obviously, which is kind of inevitable, make a bunch of dragons.
That's kind of crazy. Yeah, I mean, we should mention that, just for like rules clarification, all of the permanents enter play at the same time. So if you have something that has a landfall trigger and you have a bunch of lands, then that's all going to happen at once. So this is just going to be cast my Genesis Wave, wipe the board, and how does this work actually? Well, it doesn't matter because the 3 damage isn't going to kill all your 4/4s, but you're going to immediately get a bunch of dragons.
You're also going to choose to do the 3 damage first, then make your dragons, surely.
Is that how this works? This enters... Yes. Landfall triggers are separate triggers, and you do get to choose the order of the triggers. So yeah, that all makes sense.
I'm cool. 99% sure. Yeah, and another way to think about it, if that's unintuitive to you as a player, is, how can things happen at once in Magic? It's like, well, okay, pretend that they do happen in an order, but the whole point is that you don't put them on the stack until after the spell is done resolving. So sure, put them into play in the order they come off the top of your deck. You can think of that as the order they're coming into play. All those triggers just kind of float in the ether until the Genesis Wave is done resolving. Then you put them all in the stack. You control all of them. You do whatever you want with them. I also turned up Pyrohemia and or Pestilence, the original Pyrohemia. I think the color shifted version is actually more appropriate for modern Magic standards.
Yeah.
But that's a cool way to have a thing that behaves like a board wipe, but is a permanent and playable in this sort of context. And then the Elder Dragon War is another cool, like permanent-based board wipey kind of thing. And I also already love that there's a bunch of dragons showing up in my cards. I think that's just cool from a flavor perspective.
Interesting. Yeah, I like all those choices. I had some other more basic ones, just, Oblivion Ring, Glass Casket, Portable Hole. I agree that just sort of like leaning into this cube being very much about permanence makes sense to me and opens up some new opportunities for that sort of next level of interaction.
To the point of Dragonback Assault, my next level 1 is also just Landfall. It is, in the grand scheme of things, as far as all of Magic goes, kind of rare to get to put multiple lands into play in one turn, and Genesis Wave does this in pretty dramatic fashion. If you're casting this for a high mana value, you're probably hitting, half lands, a third lands for whatever your X is, which means you're going to get a lot of landfall triggers. And so everything from like Felidar Retreat and Emiria Angel to like Brushfire Elemental is kind of cool here, in that it's a 2-drop, but it has haste and landfall, it gets buffed. So it's like theoretical that you could, Genesis Wave and then just kill your opponent with a Brushfire Elemental. Like you put a bunch of permanents in play, but the one that actually kills them before they can like get priority or get, sorcery speed priority on their own turn is Brushfire Elemental. Obviously, Lotus Cobra does double duty here, and that it is a ramp spell that will help you cast your Genesis Wave, and also is great to hit off Genesis Wave because then you immediately make more mana and you can just do more stuff. So yeah, I think Landfall is kind of another sort of level 1 obvious, like cool interaction with Genesis Wave. And in all these sort of like level 1 things, what I'm thinking is like, okay, I'm in pack 3, I'm playing like a Bant deck, and I was just taking good cards so far. What kind of cards would I have incidentally taken that when I see Genesis Wave, I'm going to be like, ooh, actually, maybe I am a Genesis Wave deck, right? That's the sort of context I'm thinking here. And if I already have Lotus Cobra and Felidar Retreat and Aether Spellbomb and Overgrowth, then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, maybe I'm actually a pretty good Genesis Wave deck.
Sounds like you're starting to think positively about Genesis Wave.
This whole exercise is me trying to talk myself into thinking positively about Genesis Wave.
I think it's working. Yeah, I'll jump ahead further down my list just to call out some of the other landfall cards that I pulled out because I totally agree. And I think that Tatiova Benthic Druid in my sort of version, which is I'm digressing a little bit with this idea of having a pretty wrath-heavy environment. And Tatiova's like, okay, you draw a bunch of cards immediately from all those landfall triggers. And if it dies, great, you're still in great shape. Additionally, if I'm thinking about having like lots of small creatures overall, just keeping the creatures pretty small, Maha Bredegard Protector is both a landfall trigger that's going to make me some more tokens, and then also be an anthem to buff everything. So as like some things that I would see higher up at like 5 mana on my mana curve, those are some things. And obviously we got to call it Rampaging Balos because it's a cool guy.
And this is where you also get into an interesting space where, okay, now I have some sort of themes that reward me for playing lands, and then I want other ways to play more lands. And this is where Sakura Tribelter is a great glue card, right? It does everything we described. It will allow you to trigger Landfall multiple times in one turn if you want without casting a Genesis Wave.
And trigger Landfall, both at instant speed or at a specific turn in the future when it really matters.
Correct, yeah. So those kind of cards, I think, also fit here really well. And here's where we have to look at a card like, Growth Spiral or Explore and be like, okay, this kind of fits the bill in one sense, in that if I have a deck with Landfall triggers that I don't have Genesis Wave in, then these cards, kind of make those cards better. But they're also, they make every single one of these cards like that that's not a permanent does make your Genesis Wave deck a little worse. And so they don't really play too well with the Source Seed card, but they might still make sense in this environment as a complementary sort of additional support for that sort of theme. I have 2 more level 1s here. And then
still at level 1 for you.
I'm still level 1. Okay. I mean, this is my point about how I think you can actually go much deeper on a relatively simple card, right? Like using Genesis Wave, you're going to want ramp, not just ramp, but a particular type of ramp. You're going to want permanent base interaction. You're going to want Landfall. I would also argue, I didn't bother putting a category in here, but I would say permanent base card advantage. You kind of
definitely
mentioned it already with Elvish Visionary, but instead of having your cantrips be Ponders and Preordains, have them be Elvish Visionaries and Prophetic Prisms or whatever, is a great way to, again, just have little nudges to making people put Genesis Wave in their main deck. My next one is actually a sort of way possibly to make Genesis Wave almost more of a combo card, and that is a payoff for entering the battlefield. So the main cards here are like Impact Tremors or Molten Gatekeeper, the card from Modern Horizons 3 that is like an Impact Tremors, but on a creature. These are both great examples of cards that theoretically, if your opponent's at a low enough life total, you could cast a big Genesis Wave and then just kill them with the triggers right after, not have to pass the turn, which is a different sort of Genesis Wave deck than the one that's getting all this value and putting Tatyova in play and drawing cards. It's not like a big mid-range deck. You could just build a combo deck where you Lotus Bloom, make a bunch of mana in one turn and then poof, kill your opponent with Impact Tremors and Molten Gatekeeper and some other ways to sort of buff that damage a little bit. You could also imagine pairing that with, cards that make tokens on ETB, right? And then they're going to multiple times trigger the Impact Tremors and Molten Gatekeeper. That, I think, is an interesting way to think about making a red-green Impact Tremors Genesis Wave combo deck. And I do think that this is where the redundancy for Genesis Wave comes up, because you would want other ways, I think, to draw a bunch of cards or put a bunch of permanents in play in one sort of fell swoop. My last level 1, and maybe you have more than this, but I'm curious to hear. My last level 1 is perhaps the most creative here, which is that Genesis Wave just puts the cards into play. You do not have to cast them. And so
that's where Phage comes
There is
in.
some small reward for playing cards that have additional cost to cast them. And I think there's a couple here that actually make total sense. Like Dusk Rose Reliquary is a great example of permanent-based interaction that also has an additional cost to cast that you now no longer have to pay because you just get to put it into play for free automatically. So it's essentially an O-ring that you can hit off of your Genesis Wave that has ward, which most O-rings do not, and also is castable in circumstances without it. I have been adoring the card Demon of Catastrophes and the Sacred Geometry Cube. That's just a 4-mana 6/6 flyer with trample. It's 4-mana 6/6. It's a 4-mana flying Colossal Dreadmaw, but as additional to cost to cast it, you have to sacrifice a creature. That, again, you could just Genesis Wave for 4, hit your Demon of Catastrophes, and not have to worry about the additional cost. Even unassuming cards like Bayou Groff or Cobbled Lancer could be cool here. And I'm always looking for a cube to squeeze Scab Ruinator in. That's just a card I really love. It's a 3-mana 5/6 flyer that, as an additional cost to cast, you have to exile 3 creature cards from your graveyard, but you can also cast it from your graveyard. It's kind of a funky one. That is honestly not enough to be a theme, but it's a cool place to mine for new cards that you might want to put in this cube, regardless of how much it becomes an identifiable theme, right?
Yeah.
There's not enough cards with a big enough additional cost on cast that you could build a deck around putting permanents into play without casting them because of that. I mean, you have to probably pair it with taxing effects or something that would be really hard to make work with Genesis Wave as well. But it's an interesting place to mine for other cards that might fit in the cube otherwise.
Yeah, that's an interesting direction. I mean, I would say a little bit that overall kind of keeping the mana cost low, because this is kind of an interesting quirk about Genesis Wave, is they've tacked on that, you get permanents of mana value X or less, just so it's not I cast this for 4 after using Sensei's Divining Top and put Emrakul into play. No, it's about, you got to do it big and get a whole bunch of stuff at once. But that does mean if you can overall keep the mana cost of your deck lower, you're going to be in a much better place for it to actually succeed.
Which is kind of interesting because you, generally speaking, in a cube where we want Genesis Wave to be castable in the late game, you probably wouldn't want a low mana value deck.
Yeah,
you would want a deck full of powerful cards that had a lot of individual raw power level, even at a high mana value, because if the game's going to turn a 7 or 8 or 9, you don't want to be casting Aether Spell Bombs at that point. You want to be casting 5 and 6 drops.
Yeah, which almost leads me to be thinking, I didn't go down this very deeply, but the idea of like, okay, well, can we have more things that are mana sinks when they're in play? So you still have that flexibility of stuff to do in the late game, but still works in this space.
Did you have any other like level 1 thoughts about Genesis Wave before we expand our lens and start looking at level 2 interactions?
I wasn't as structured in terms of having like specific levels. The way I approached it from there was sort of thinking, okay, if I want this environment where I'm trying to balance wraths versus putting a bunch of permanents into play, how can I get sort of trinkety artifacts that end up making sense? So like a big one that I started sort of building around was serrated arrows. This is something that, okay, if I have small creatures, serrated arrows, it's another permanent I can get into play and is going to be relevant.
Permanent-based interaction.
Permanent-based interaction. Sky Sovereign Console Flagship is another, like, okay, this is great because it's immediately interaction, it's immediately removal, but in the face of a wrath, it also leaves behind this vehicle that's going to be relevant. And again, serrated arrows, Sky Sovereign, not in the same sort of space power level-wise, but we'll work on those details later. The other big facet was like, okay, well, what if your opponent has Wrath of God? Are there other types of creatures that are going to be effective there? What about something like Falcon Wrath Aristocrat or Yahini Undying Partisan? These are creatures that you can sacrifice your other creatures to make them indestructible, which sort of allows you to maintain some board state, but also kind of starts building this Aristocrats theme around that.
Those are your 2 examples of ways to make your board indestructible?
Yeah, I told you I'm not putting in Avacyn Angel of Hope.
No, I'm talking about the 2-mana spirit that tons of people play, not these like weird.
No, I thought this was more cool. We got to be weird and fringe.
I can't remember the spirit's name off the top of my head.
Syndicate Trafficker. Okay, so now we have this a little bit of a theme of like sacrifice and artifact sacrifice that might be interesting here.
Well, I started thinking about level 2 interactions from here. So at this point, I'm not even really thinking about Genesis Wave anymore. I'm just saying, all right, from Genesis Wave.
I'm still thinking about Genesis Wave.
From Genesis Wave, I arrived at a certain type of ramp spell. I arrived at a certain type of permanent-based interaction. I arrived at caring about Landfall, and I arrived at caring about Enter the Battlefield, potentially in a sort of combo sense, and also the additional casting cost stuff, which I think is just much narrower and thinner. The first card I thought of based off of, I think the category that has the most ripe for additional cards to pair with it is the permanent-based interaction category. And the obvious cards that came to mind there for me, first of all, was Muldrotha the Gravetide, which is a card that really thrives if you have permanents you can choose to put in the graveyard, which most of these permanent-based interaction spells do it on sacrificing the permanent rather than it coming into play. At least the ones I picked. Not O-Rings and things like you mentioned, but all the spell bombs, all the seals, all that kind of stuff.
Deadweight, that's probably going to go to the graveyard.
For sure. Deadweight's a great example of a really, Deadweight's A+ permanent-based interaction in this cube. And there's other auras that also effectively kill creatures, so another good place to look. And Muldrotha is a great payoff for those, whether you have a Genesis Wave or not. It's also worth noting that one thing I didn't touch on in my level 1, which is very real, is that the cards that you don't cast off Genesis Wave do go to the graveyard. So if you have a reanimation theme, and again, this could be at any power level, you could have 4-mana reanimation spells, or you could have 1-mana reanimation spells, but if you have a reanimation theme, then you're not even necessarily sad that you cast Genesis Wave for 3 and hit Muldrotha, Animate Dead, and a land, because then you just Animate Dead the Muldrotha. Great.
Right. So
that's cool.
How does that work with those reanimation spells? It's one of those, if Animate Dead enters the battlefield,
Dead works,
if it would be in the battlefield.
Yeah, as Animate Dead enters the battlefield, if it's on the battlefield, it becomes an R with a enchant creature in graveyard. Yeah.
So you can reanimate something that just got put to the graveyard
I believe so.
Genesis
Wave.
I
think for the same reason we said earlier.
That's a pretty cool interaction.
Genesis Wave happens, and then you get all your triggers.
Yeah.
And that includes the...
And state-based...
Unless Animate Dead is like a replacement effect for entering the battlefield, because I don't...
It might be.
It could be.
Judge Bones?
We'll send this to Judge Bones. He has some time to give us feedback on it. Anyway, my point is that if I had my expensive spells that I didn't mind being in the graveyard, another great example would be like a Scourge of Nel-Toth. I don't mind my Scourge of Nel-Toth being in the graveyard. It's probably where I want it, actually. And so I'm not going to be holding back on my Genesis Wave until I hit Scourge of Nel-Toth mana. I'm just going to be willing to cast it for a reasonable amount. And if I bin the Scourge of Nel-Toth, that's just kind of gravy, But anyway, Muldrotha is one of the first cards I thought of for permanent-based interaction. And then I thought about Savin's Reclamation, which is very cool here for a couple of reasons. It's not a permanent spell. It does not work with Genesis Wave, but it does have flashback. So you're going to put it in your graveyard when you cast Genesis Wave and you reveal Savin's Reclamation, which is still kind of working. It draws you a card, and that card is a 5-mana Savin's Reclamation for 2 permanents. It also obviously will have a ton of targets in this cube, and I would argue a much more interesting swath of targets. If Savin's Reclamation is just getting back one of your 3-drop creatures in your, creature-based deck, that's fine. The Savin's Reclamation can definitely do that. It's like a 3-for-1 that's kind of slow and expensive, but can be really good against control decks. I think it's way more interesting when it can get back a removal spell, a card draw spell, a threat, some other piece of interaction. And if we're leaning towards permanent-based things, then that's obviously what it can do in an environment like this, which I think is really cool. And then this is just an archetype I love and always come back to, and like almost every cube I design has this for a little while at some point, and that is like a Second Sunrise, Faith's Reward, brought back kind of vibe. And especially brought back is one I really want to highlight here. If you're familiar with Faith's Reward and Second Sunrise, those are ways to get all your permanents went to the graveyard this turn back into play, which you often play in combination with sacrifice effects to like cycle through all your permanents, get a bunch of triggers. Brought back is like a very mini version of that. It's just white wait for an instant, choose up to 2 target permanent cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn and return to the battlefield tapped. And that to me, if I have like a control deck where my interaction is primarily permanent based, that's just so sick. It's so sick to get to like bounce your thing with every spell bomb, maybe sacrifice Pyre spell bomb and draw a card, and then brought back them both. And now I, recoup all that card loss and I'm back to where I was before. I effectively drew 2 cards. It's very cool.
Are those cards that you feel like have a like general purpose or fair gameplay, or you think they're really dedicated, like I'm trying to do this combo and like get a whole bunch of my cards in my graveyard all at once? Like what's the range of utility there?
I think that's one of those things you have total control over as a cube designer. Like the cards you include will decide whether or not a fair Second Sunrise or a fair Faith's Reward makes sense. I think brought back is honestly always kind of fair. I think that's what it does. It like costs less mana, but it doesn't have as many combo applications, but it has way more fair applications. I don't actually have brought back itself in Hunter Ornithopters just yet, but I've been dabbling with the idea. I actually have a copy sitting right here in case they want to add it, because I've actually found in that cube a couple of times I'm very happy to just Second Sunrise like a fetch land and my one Saga that just died. That's actually fine in that cube sometimes if you're like digging for something to do. And so I think, it depends on the cube. You can definitely get away with making those cards much more fair.
That makes sense. Yeah, I'll just mention right here, because you're talking about sort of permanent-based removal, some other things that immediately stood out to me were things like Reclamation Sage is kind of a shoe-in here. And it's sort of funny how I think that if we're talking about here's a cube where a lot of the removal is based on permanents, and then here's another permanent that can remove your permanent, it's like we're still playing this back and forth game. It's just what might happen on the stack in some more high-powered cubes is now happening just in play on the battlefield. Twin Shot Sniper is a great example of a thing that, you can channel it to just shock something, or if you hit it off your Genesis Wave, you're in good shape. I feel like I had some other... Oh, you mentioned sort of permanent-based card advantage. Organ Hoarder was one that I came across. What do you think about Vendilion Clique in a space where you might want to be casting Genesis Wave?
I mean, I love Vendilion Clique. I feel like that card scales really well to the power level of the environment, with the caveat that there's like a floor where if a 3/1 flash is just crazy good, then obviously it's not going to continue to scale below that floor. But anywhere where a 3/1 flash for 3 is like, on rate or like maybe even a little below rate, it's, I think, excellent and scales really well with the environment because it gives you so much utility and choice, and you can target yourself, you can target your opponent. So I think it's a great flexible card. I like it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also interesting. It might just feel less bad to have your Genesis Wave shuffled back into your deck, which honestly might be good for you if you're the person with it in your hand.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like almost always if you... if we can make it a cube where it's correct...
I'm going to take your ramp spell instead, so you just never cast it. That's probably going to be the right choice. But
yeah, like if you're on 5 mana and have Genesis Wave and anything else in your hand, and I cast Vendilion Clique, I'm just going to leave you with the... I'll say... keep them. You can have them.
Oh, right, that is an option.
You can just say keep them, because the chances that you're Genesis Wave for like 3 or max 4 before I just kill you with Vendilion Clique is going to actually turn the game around seems pretty narrow.
Yeah, that's fair. And then obviously we have Ravenous Chupacabra and similar things of that ilk for just creature interaction.
Then we come across my first card that I think is like my form of redundancy. You mentioned, is it Primal Surge, the card that is actually mechanically kind of close to what...
In certain cases, it can be.
Yeah, and what I mean by redundancy is not necessarily cards that do like as close to the exact same thing as possible, but cards that kind of like fill the same role and reward the same overall broad play patterns. And one I came up with from my permanent paste interaction, which I think is perfect in a cube like this, is Dance of the Manse. It's another X spell, X white blue, to return up to X target artifact and or non-aura enchantment cards, each with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And if X is 6 or more, they become 4/4 creatures in addition to their other types. This rewards all the same things. It's another big X spell. It's another thing your opponent could be wanting to ramp towards. It just does kind of very similar stuff and plays with a lot of similar cards. They have to be permanent cards. In the case of Dance of the Mance, they have to be artifacts or enchantments, which is obviously a subset of permanents that Genesis Wave is going to hit. It just feels to me like it fits perfectly and like complements the like heavy green, Genesis Wave. Here's something white blue can be doing that's going to have a similar texture where you cast this big spell and the whole game, turns around in one turn.
Yeah, I love this card. And I love that it both has that sort of mechanical connection where it makes sense and there's like enough shared cards that you can sort of have enough redundancy to support these two kind of different feeling payoffs. But they're also similar in being big X spells in different colors that are going to put a bunch of stuff into play. It sort of is starting to allude at, hey, this is the vibe of what this cube is all about.
Right,
it's
exactly.
like, let's build towards and set up getting everything in place so I can do this one big swingy thing.
To that end, one more card I pulled out here that I think is a similar vibe. It's actually a lot less similar in terms of like rewarding the same stuff. It's actually kind of the opposite, is Villainous Wealth. I think Villainous Wealth maybe belongs in the same cube that is going to include Genesis Wave, which is basically just a Genesis Wave for your opponent, and they don't have to be permanent spells, and you don't get lands. That's pretty much what Villainous Wealth does.
I don't hate it. I do kind of love the potential for narrative here, where your opponent casts Villainous Wealth, and you're looking at your Genesis Wave, and you're like, I was going to do that.
Exactly
that was going to be me. Those were mine. Or you hit their Genesis Wave and then cast it for X is 0, because that's how it works.
Yeah, but Dance of the Mance, Villainous Wealth, I think, start to feel like they fit the vibe. I even wondered about like just a big fireball in red, like how appropriate is that to also have a big X spell in like red that does something much more direct and like less tricky, but still something cool. Those are some of the cards they came up with that were like felt like redundancy in the way that I mean redundancy when I'm talking about cube design.
Yeah, I mean, it's redundancy, but it's also this sort of aesthetic redundancy, which I think is starting to build its identity. I was thinking about that specific aspect in sort of a little side quest of this journey and thinking about cards with Cascade or Discover. So things like Geological Appraiser or Bloodbraid Elf or Maelstrom Wanderer. The Discover is nice because it actually interacts with Genesis Wave. If you hit your Geological Appraiser, you get to sort of do that cascade. Bloodbraid Elf and Maelstrom Wanderer don't actually work, but I feel like, I don't know, I'd have to think more about how much I hate having those two really similar mechanics in the same cube. It's not ideal. But I think having more things that just allude to, hey, this cube is about spin the wheel, get a bunch of cards off the top of your library. Like, I think that's starting to build that kind of vibe and setting people's expectations for what kind of gameplay to expect as they're drafting and seeing these types of cards. That seems valuable to me.
Brother, if you want me to put Genesis Wave in my deck, do not give me Cascade cards. That is, I will never put Genesis Wave in my deck. If
Geological Appraiser, and that's going to be fine.
Elf in a million years.
Maybe we'll get a Trumpeting Carnosaur. So my sort of next bigger level, my sort of where I am with my structure is I'm thinking fairly heavy wraths, lots of nice little trinkety artifacts, permanent-based ramp that most of it is not super interrupted by the wraths. And I'm trying to think about what else can I do? What other themes can I have that are going to utilize those trinkety artifacts and also be able to maybe do something interesting when you get a bunch of permanents in play all at once? So 2 directions I went with that were Goblin Bombardment. Makes a lot of sense if you get a bunch of little permanents in play.
And hey, I already added Second Sunrise, so great.
Yeah, that's cool. Let's do that. This is a little bit not quite that, but like Sadistic Hypnotist, why not? If your opponent's going to make you sacrifice all your creatures next turn, what if you just sacrifice them all right now to make your opponent discard their whole hand?
Yeah, that's a rude card.
That sounds like fun. I'm always kind of looking for a place to put Sadistic Hypnotist. And some other trinkety things like Pilgrim's Eye, Filigree Familiar, Scrapwork Mutt. These are all feeling good to me. And while we're doing that...
I like having Scrapwork Mutt so I can discard my Genesis Wave most of the time that I draw it, except for the one time when I draw it on turn 12.
Yeah. Since we're doing a lot of artifact stuff, I think that Slow Bad Goblin Tinker, which can make some of your artifacts indestructible, is kind of interesting, and Goblin Welder and similar cards.
Welder deck is cool too.
Welder deck is cool.
Because you could also flip big artifacts into the graveyard with Genesis Wave.
Exactly, yeah.
Like, pretty cool to Genesis Wave. All right, again, I'm imagining like really cool Genesis Waves for 3. This one is you hit Goblin Welder, Lightning Greaves, and Blightsteel Colossus or whatever,
Yeah. And it's worth noting you can choose
that's very cool.
not
Then you just
to
kill your
cast
opponent.
some of the cards. So let me hit you with a Genesis Wave for 4. Those 3, but you also have Anger. And you can just say, oh, I choose not to cast Anger, and I'm just going to put it in the graveyard.
Well, okay, but you could make it for 3 still.
But you named 3 cards, right?
But you don't need Lightning Greaves if you have the
Oh, you said lightning. Yeah, I wasn't listening
If you
enough.
have the
Never mind.
anger.
Don't worry about it. It's just for 2. It's great. You love it. Yeah, I think Anger is a very cool card here. Anger's cool in every cube. What about Sling Gang Lieutenant? We could do a little bit of a Goblins theme since we're talking about these Goblin Tinkerers. I know you've had that in a couple of your cubes.
Well, definitely like level 2 beyond my sort of ETB combo sort of level 1 is things like Sling Gang Lieutenant, Siege Gang Commander, cards that enter the battlefield and make a bunch of tokens because it's going to trigger Impact Tremors a bunch.
Trigger everything.
That all just fits together.
And then another pretty clean payoff for like making a bunch of tokens is Lampad of Death's Vigil, which is a card that I think looks kind of dorky, but then I've really enjoyed it in my cube. It just lets you turn a bunch of creatures into a bunch of damage. And again, I'm thinking a little bit about I'm trying to create an environment where you're going to be casting your giant spell, so I'm expecting games to be a little bit grindy, so ways to get some reach and actually kill your opponent from a big board state, even if they have their own big board state, is kind of important. A trinkety artifact that I think is actually kind of cool here, like uniquely interesting here, is Elsewhere Flask. This is a 2-mana artifact that's going to immediately draw a card, and then you can sacrifice it to make all your lands any basic of any type. So if you have color-intensive stuff like Genesis Wave, this is both going to, sort of do both sides of the coin, where if you hit it off Genesis Wave, it gets your card back, or if you need to cast this really color-intensive spell, it'll help you fix your mana.
That's a little cute.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. That's where we're at with it.
I can't imagine being like, well, I don't have enough green sources for Genesis Wave, but I do have Elsewhere Flask, so in you go, Genesis Wave.
I have made cubes where people have said, look, here's my... No, you're right. You should have enough green sources, but maybe you won't.
Like I said, it's cute.
What's the card I'm trying to think of? Phyrexian Obliterator off Elsewhere Flask in their cube with no... or their deck with no swamps. There are dreams to be had here.
Did you have Elsewhere Flask in the irregular cube?
Yes.
Wow. Max would pull it off every single time.
Of course.
Max would just have it.
All right, what else you got? So I'm feeling pretty good about sort of the structure that I have here. I have a lot of a artifact and sacrifice theme, lots of ways to reward you for getting a bunch of permanents into play, and I almost wonder if this could feel like it plays out a little bit like 100 Ornithopters, where it's like, I have this big turn where I put a bunch of stuff in play, and then my opponent bounces everything, and then I recast it next turn, and there's sort of still this opportunity for big swings, but still having a lot of back and forth within those swings. That's my ideal version, and it's going to take some tuning to get the gameplay there, but I have dreams.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have demonstrated that from the simple starting point of Genesis Wave, there are a lot of directions you can go, and a lot of themes you can start to mine from that one card, and then you start mining themes from those cards, and you just keep repeating this process until you've got enough cards to draft, and that's your first version of your cube. And like you said, is it going to be perfectly in balance? No, but you can figure out how to balance it by playing it, and also draft is self-balancing, so it'll actually probably be pretty okay, believe it or not. I have a couple open questions.
Okay.
That are maybe starting to like inch their way into more like development than design, but it's kind of a blurry line. Did you give any thought to what you want the most aggressive deck to look like in this cube?
Only in so much as I want the cube to be slow enough that casting a huge spell makes sense, so I don't want it to be as aggressive as I normally would as a baseline. And I know that there's going to be some risk with that, so making sure that there's some counterplay to that. I mean, something like Goblin Bombardment is obviously a way to kill your opponent when you have like a big sort of board stall. I think Gingerbrute is something else that I threw on my list because it interacts with that kind of artifact theme and is also a way to, an equipment or vehicles or other things that you can have left behind if your opponent casts a board wipe. So Gingerbrute's going to work with those equipments. But I didn't think really deeply about like, okay, what is the most aggressive deck going to look like?
Yeah, I think that is an open question to me, and I think with what we've described here as a lot of, for lack of a better word, like Muldrifter style value permanents that are going to provide some additional value, and a lot of them are going to come attached to a body. We mentioned Outward Visionary, we mentioned Reclamation Sage, we mentioned all these sort of trinkety artifacts that draw a card in ETB and then do something else. Even if you leave Genesis Wave out completely, that's already an environment that I think aggro is going to kind of struggle in.
Yeah, I think so.
Because
just lots of little
Outward
permanents
Visionary
getting in play.
is the worst nightmare for most aggro decks because you're going to have one toughness attackers, and now your opponent played a cantripping removal spell that gained them a little life because it also absorbs an attack. And that's pretty bad. So the more of those you have in this cube, I think aggro is already going to suffer a little bit. And what you kind of alluded to was making the aggressive decks not just about playing creatures and turning them sideways, but about having some kind of synergy, like the Goblin Bombardment style sort of reach, or I mentioned the sort of Impact Tremors combo that you could potentially pull off, which it could be a combo, right? You could put Shrieking Drake in if you wanted to in this cube, and then you kind of have a Shrieking Drake Impact Tremors combo. You could put a Lurin in this cube if you wanted to get crazy with it. But it could also just be a value deck where you play Mog War Marshal and Sling Gang Lieutenant and Siege Gang Commander, and your Impact Tremors is just good enough, on rate in a deck like that, perhaps.
It's a lot of damage there.
Yeah, those cards all provide reach in a way that will allow your aggressive deck, the deck that is going to not be as well equipped to go to a super long game, to kill their opponent even after they've played a bunch of, can-tripping Fibblethips. I do think that, if I was going to turn this into a real cube, this is where I would start looking for, a complementary seed. Like, you mentioned that, you don't usually... I don't think any of us have built it. Well, I was about to say, I was built a whole cube based on Hunter Ornithopters. That one aside...
That's a pretty clear seed.
That one aside, I don't think any of us have built a cube that was around a single card. But like you said, a lot of times some of these, webs of a couple different cards come together and start to form a bigger picture. And so, okay... This gave me a good idea of what I want the suite of interaction to look like, of what I want the, big sort of haymakers in the environment to look like, and what I want them to hinge on. And I think it's cool to have your haymakers hinge on deck construction, right? Like Genesis Wave, Dance of the Manse are cards that will absolutely turn the game around completely and, do so in one turn, but really only in the right deck. You can't just jam Dance of the Manse in a 5-color good stuff deck and have it work. You have to have thought about what kind of deck you're putting it into. So all those things are sort of defined, and what I would basically look for is okay, what's an aggressive card that I really love that can help me give some shape to these other parts of the cube? And I think there's probably dozens or more equally viable different directions you could take the more aggressive decks in this sort of context that would still be complementary and within balance with these other themes you've already kind of fleshed out more.
Did you pick a specific card, or you're just saying that's the direction you would go?
I'm just saying a simple question.
That makes a lot of sense, and I like that idea of just thinking of okay, where are the gaps? Where's the limitations to the structure we have? And then let's cast around for more seeds. And in reality, you probably have a bunch of notes of hey, here's this card I've thought about a couple times and just never quite gotten there.
Yeah, you all have that, right? You all just have a bunch of notes that are just magic card names.
Yes, we all have these. We all have a bunch of
this is normal.
Whether you use Scryfall for your deck lists or Moxfield, you got a bunch of lists that are just these are, or you just have literal piles. Yeah, never mind. Magic players.
This is my list.
You already have a cube. It's the pile of cards on your desk.
I have a 3 by 10 tray sitting in front of me. So 30 individual cells.
You still can't find room for this pile.
I'm working on it. I have a busy life.
Yeah. I guess the one card that maybe would, or maybe two that sort of speak to that in my list of random stuff that I was sort of accumulating was Reflector Mage being a tempo card could be an interesting alternative, and maybe not trying to make red the most aggressive deck in the format. Or Glyph Elemental is a big thing with Landfall, maybe making this sort of focused Landfall deck and aggressive sort of counterbalance in the environment. That could be interesting.
I also think that's a place where you can think about kind of Punisher cards. Maybe this is a cube for Ankh of Mishra, which deals damage to every player for every land they put into play. Just
finally, an environment where Price of Progress makes sense and will be good.
Price of Progress is good in almost every cube, and people just don't put it in there because it's awful. I mean, awful as in terrible play patterns.
I understand.
Ankh of Mishra at least is face up. You know? It'd be pretty fun to roll the Ankh of Mishra die and be well, I hope I don't hit 4 lands in my top 7 cards, because then I die. But if I don't, I probably win. That'd be fun.
But maybe you also have Darien, King of Kjeldor, and you're I sure hope I hit a bunch of lands to make some 1/1s. That's what he does, right?
Yeah, because Ankh is triggers, so you could stack those, and then
we're on level 3, Ankh of Mishra plus Darien.
Level 4 is Darien. I mean, how do you get from Genesis Wave to Darien, King of Kjeldor? That's how you do it, through this sort of layers of remove.
Is one of your open questions what the mana base looks like?
Yes.
Great. What does the mana base look like?
So far,
it's an open
as far
question.
As I'm concerned, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx is what the mana base looks like.
The only land that I actually put on my list, I think fetch lands are implied because we're talking about landfall. That makes a lot of sense to me. So I think fetch lands make a lot of sense, and I also threw a Celestial Colonnade in this list. I should pick some different creature lands because I love that one. But again, things that are going to serve a control deck and play around Wraths seem interesting.
Yeah, I think a related question, though not as related as everyone thinks, is how many colors you want the average deck to be in this cube. And Genesis Wave certainly implies a pretty heavy devotion to green to make it work. Although,
but to your point, if you're casting it for 10, its percentage of green is not that high.
Precisely. And I would probably, completely parallel to all of this, I really think the next cube by design will have no gold cards. I think that is a thing that I'm kind of committed to. I don't think this is the cube for no gold cards, so I did think about it a lot. It's just that with such specific immersion themes, not being able to include Dance of the Mance or Muldrotha or, Dragon Back Assault would be kind of a big bummer, at least for the direction I started taking this. But I would probably be very light touch with my gold cards and in this particular cube, and also try and encourage, more committed decks to specific colors, more payoffs with double or even triple pips in their mana cost, I think would be appropriate here.
Suddenly that Elsewhere flask starts looking pretty appealing.
I'm still not sure.
Card's fine. Don't worry about it.
My last, much more specific open question. We talked about onboard interaction. How do you feel about onboard counterspells? A little spike tail hatchling.
Yeah, I definitely like that more than a hard counterspell. I think that, presenting somebody with the option of like, okay, you got to fight your way through this one way or another. And I like that spike tail hatchling is also evasive and does present a little bit of a clock. I'm okay with that.
The smallest possible clock, but a clock nonetheless.
Smallest possible. Is it only a 1? I thought it was
There's
2/2.
spike tail Drake and spike tail hatchling. One's a 3-mana 2/2, and one's a 2-mana 1/1.
Oh, I see. I'm thinking of the Drakeling. I would definitely put him on this list and
Judges
play with
familiar
him and see how it feels in the end.
That, I feel like, is way healthier for the environment than a 4 spike. Because at least then all right, well, my opponent's got Judges Familiar in play. That basically is just a Thalia for my Genesis Wave. It also, in the case of all those cards, they're all creatures. They present you more opportunity to use removal spells on them, force your opponent to block with them because you're putting your pressure in their life total. Like, you have counterplay versus the 4 spike you don't know about in their hand or whatever. So I think if one of my concerns with the sort of direction I started taking this was that this might end up being the sort of what I call parallel solitaire kind of cube, where everyone's deck is synergistic and there's not a ton of like true meaningful interaction running around. Like, I love Aether Spellbomb, but it's not the kind of card that's going to like disassemble your whole deck in the way that some rule does.
Maybe I've been building my decks wrong. Sometimes I just
Anthony
feel
boggles
wrecked.
without hexproof.
Where did I do that? Oh, I've done that recently.
But I do think that if you're thirsty for more of that sort of onboard counterplay, those cards all also work with Genesis Wave. You can, Genesis Wave into your Spiketail Hatchling and your Judge's Familiar, and now your opponent has their answers taxed further, which is kind of interesting. So that's another open question where I think a lot of people really hate playing against those because they would much rather be surprised by the counterspell because they can pretend like they never should have played around it and it's not their fault at all. Whereas,
which is arguably true.
Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. But if it's on board the entire time, then it's the thing you have to like continue to be aware of. And if your opponent is not gracious, they might get you with it and not let you take back your casting of it or some dumb thing like that. So they're very divisive cards, I would say, that you would be very reasonable to just exclude a priori, but venue of interaction you could perhaps explore if you wanted to. Are you going to build the Genesis Wave Cube, Anthony?
I'm going to say 40-60.
So if we convert that ratio to 360 cards, 40% of 360.
I have 95 cards in this list right here.
120 plus 40% of 60.
We add 60 lands. We're doing different math here. We're playing Parallel Solitaire.
I think if you're that far along, you're basically already at a 180 card cube almost, and then you could just play test it with 4 people a couple times, see how it goes.
That's true.
Then your opponent is twice as likely to have Genesis Wave.
Now let's answer the big question. Do we break Singleton for Genesis Wave?
That was one of the first things I thought about, and I think absolutely not. I mean, that's certainly a direction you could take this. I would not.
Yeah. Although I was thinking about breaking Singleton and sort of like, it's been a while since I have designed a cube from scratch in this way, or designed a cube, and...
What is the last cube you designed?
Is a half finished.
Like
Turbo Cube?
Which you started, what?
A long time ago.
6 years ago? 5 years ago?
No, it's fine. I've been helping other people with their cubes. It's fine.
We're going to get so many Reddit comments about how you don't know what you're talking about because you haven't designed a cube in the last 3 years.
I don't know if you heard the big news, but Stu on UberCube is building a cube at last. And I'm like, oh no, end of an era, the bit of the Cube podcast without a cube.
It was a really good bit.
I thought it was a great bit.
Very good bit.
But Stu, congratulations on the cube. As I was sort of going through this, I'm like, okay, I kind of just want like a bunch of Reclamation Sages because they kind of fit in here. And I think that as I would be building out this structure, just saying, yeah, let's just start with 3-4 Reclamation Sages. And sure, I might go digging through the Spider-Man and Final Fantasy cards and maybe find more things that are...
You can just play Manglehorn.
Manglehorn, sure. So I could move towards Singleton eventually, but I think it would be totally reasonable as a starting point just to be like, yeah, I want this much of this type of effect. I'm just going to block that out with a bunch of known simple cards.
I do think most cube designers at this stage do not have any sense of how much they want of a certain type of effect. I think that's one of the last things they figure out, even after playtesting, being like, oh, actually, I have way more of this effect than I wanted, and I sideboard a couple, and I would have given anything for another reclamation stage. I think it's kind of hard, and maybe...
I mean, I guess I'm just, like, built different, but...
Yeah, no, you're just really good at this, and I've done it a whole bunch, but not for many, many years. And so you might have a sense of that, but I would discourage breaking singleton until you really know you need to. I personally would not advise the method of, like, I'll just assume I need 4 of these. All right, well, I guess tune in to future episodes to see if Anthony builds a Genesis Wave cube or any other cube ever again.
What would you name it? Is there a good pun?
Is there good flavor text on any copies of Genesis Wave, or is there no flavor text? Is there too much rules text?
Probably got too much rules text.
Too much rules text to fit any flavor text. Genesis Wave, Genesis Cube, Genesis Wave from the sidelines, riding the wave, the green wave,
You're so close.
Improv is hard, you know? And on that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to support the show, you can find us on Patreon, which we use to pay our lovely editor, Matthew, as well as pay our bills for web hosting and podcast hosting and all other kinds of stuff. We have a operational cost page on the website that we are completely transparent about all of our costs for the past 7 or 8 years, however long we've been doing this thing. So you can check that out if you want to see where that money's going. And a lot of that we do give back to the community in the form of our Cube Fellowship. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nassi, and the show is edited by Matthew. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast, and this podcast is produced by I Think You Really Hard About Magic Cards and Speaking to Microphones about it. And I didn't say it last time, but if we got anything wrong about rules text in this episode, that was intentional to bait you for engagement. So when I said last week that you could simply name Soldier with your Metallic Mimic when you played your bunny offspring, mouse offspring guy, and then someone pointed out in the comments that, oh, well, that means the mouse guy is not going to buff the Metallic Mimic anymore. I knew that already. That was obvious. I am built different, just like Anthony. And you got baited for engagement. Thanks for the engagement, chump.
I don't know. I actually kind of appreciate that rules clarification because I feel like I have a pretty good sense of all the rules, things that can come up in my cube, and I also miss that. So.
And it's just one of the ones where, like, if you read it, it's so obvious.
Yeah.
But
obvious. It's so obvious.
But you just think when you name the card, it's like, oh, well, now these are the same creature type.
I think that was a really good example of the kind of mental shortcuts and mental cross-wirings that can happen.
And that we do intentionally for
demonstrate.
For engagement.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, thanks for the gift of friendship and cube, etc.
Thank you for talking about a card that I know doesn't make you happy for a whole hour.
I don't. It's just not my kind of card. I'm not like, it doesn't, it's not like I see the card and I'm like, like, it's fine.
I literally have heard you do that.
I guess if my opponent put it on the stack, I would probably be like,
every time.